Well, hey, everybody. Happy Sunday to you. Thanks for being here today. Some of you might remember a couple weeks ago, I wasn't feeling good. I was pretty sick, and I ended up being one of the shortest services we've ever had here at CCC, and it was one of the shortest messages I've ever given here in the history of our church. I just want you to know that the time that I forfeited that day, I'm probably going to use today. I just wanted to heads you up to that. Maybe not. We'll see. But we spent the beginning of the year looking at several different Psalms from the Bible, one each week. And before we get to today's Psalm, I think it's important for us to understand what the Psalms are not. And you may want to keep this in mind if you're reading through the Psalms at some time or another. But a lot of folks will go and buy a little devotional book filled with uplifting thoughts and inspiring words, and they maybe read a page in the morning, and they might take the last thing that they read and kind of carry that with them throughout their day to kind of, maybe try to start their day off on a positive note, or to put them in a good mood, or try to make them happy in some way, shape, and form. And that's not a bad thing to do in and of itself, but people will often open up the Bible and turn to the book of Psalms hoping to have that kind of experience. They hope that every psalm will be a, piece of uplifting, inspirational, devotional literature. And about half the time it works out like that. But then the other half of the time, the Psalms, well, they're kind of like a downer. They're head scratchers. For instance, Psalm 136 is a psalm of thanksgiving. It says, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods. His love endures forever." And it just goes on like that through the entire psalm. It's a great psalm. It really is. And it can put you in a great frame of mind. And that's good. But then the next day, you might read the very next psalm, which is Psalm 137. And here's how Psalm 137 ends. "O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy are those who repay you for what you have done, those who seize your infants and dash them against the rocks." And you read that in the morning and you think, holy cow, somebody got up on the wrong side of the bed when they wrote that psalm. What is up with this? That is not a happy thought that I want to take with me throughout my day. And a lot of people will come up to something like that and they don't know what to make of it. And so what inevitably happens is they typically just give up on the Psalms. See, it's important to understand that the Bible has all kinds of different literature in it. It has books of history. It has books of wisdom like Proverbs. It has eyewitness accounts like the Gospels. It has letters of instruction like the epistles of the Apostle Paul. And it's very important that we understand the kind of literature that the Psalms consist of. The Psalms really are very much like reading somebody's spiritual journal. That's essentially what the Psalms are. If you've ever journaled before, or you know somebody who has, usually it's uncensored, unfiltered, raw expressions of the heart. None of the highs or lows get flattened out. And that's the way the Psalms are. In fact, every situation in life is represented in the book of Psalms. The highs, the lows, everything in between. As Eugene Peterson, he articulates it like this: Psalms are a magnetic center pulling every scrap and dimension of human experience into the presence of God. The Psalms are indiscriminate in their subject matter. Complaint and thanks, doubt and anger, outcries of pain, outbursts of joy, quiet reflection, boisterous worship. If it's human, it qualifies. See, the Psalms, they teach us to bring all of our lives and all their fullness before God and all his fullness. They teach us to bring all of our lives with all of its messiness, all the ups and downs, before God and the fullness of who he is. Which brings us to today's psalm, which is Psalm 73. If you have a Bible, get to the 73rd Psalm. And here's the question I want us to think about as we begin to look at Psalm 73. Have you ever found yourself in a spiritual sort of funk? And I'm not asking you if you've ever been like dry spiritually. I'm not asking if you've ever like drifted off course a few degrees. I'm not even asking if you've ever felt disconnected to God. Like we talked about that a few weeks back in Psalm 42. I'm talking about a spiritual like brooding, like a dark, cynical, maybe even resentful place with God. Like when you're in a spiritual funk, it's like you have an issue with God. You got a beef with God. You're contending with him about something. It's like you're putting God on trial. You know, you're pacing back and forth like an amped up trial attorney, and you're peppering God with questions like inside of you, inside your spirit. Sometimes you might even be making outright accusations against God. Like what goes through your mind might be something like this. You say, God, you've allowed this to happen in my life and that to happen in my life, and it wasn't cool. It was, in fact, painful. And you could have stopped that, but you didn't. Like you could have done something about that. You could have, brought some goodness or mercy or maybe even justice to my particular situation, and you seem to be sitting idly by. What are you doing? God is known as a God of mercy, and yet you seem to be receiving no hand of mercy from the God of heaven. In Psalm 73, Asaph is the writer. This is not a Davidic psalm like we looked at last week or the week before. This is a guy named Asaph, of whom we know very little about. But he reveals that he's been in a deep spiritual funk, and that it's lasted so long and it's messed with him so badly that he freely admits in verse 2, but as for me, my feet had almost slipped. I had nearly lost my foothold. Like in today's vernacular, we would say something like, I almost bailed on you, God. I almost walked away from my faith altogether. I mean, this deal that I'm concerned about has just knocked the spiritual wind out of my sail, and it's knocked me off my feet, and I'm just about ready to pull the plug. You ever felt like that? You've been crying out to God for some good outcome in your life or somebody's life that you really care about, and you faithfully go to God with that request, but it seems like the pipeline to God's ear is shut off. Or if he's hearing you, it seems like he's ignoring you, and it doesn't seem fair. Like it's not a selfish request. You're not asking to win the lottery or something like that. This is a very redeemable thing that you're crying out to him about. But your prayer goes unanswered, and you don't understand why. I have a feeling there are lots and lots and lots of people in this room who have been there before, or maybe you're there now. I mean, what exactly is the deal that's messed with Asaph so much? What's revealed in verse 3, one sentence, he says it in. Verse 3, I saw the prosperity of the wicked. I saw the prosperity of the wicked. What drove Asaph into a deep, brooding, spiritual, dark place is that, as we'll find out in a minute, he was busting it to love God with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength. He was busting it to live a clean and honorable life before God. He was fighting off temptation. He wasn't caving in to compromise. He was doing everything he could to put God first in his life. And yet there were problems and pressures and disappointments that were coming his way. And if that weren't bad enough, he looked around at the people around him who were just blowing off God. They were taking his name in vain. They were spitting on his laws and statutes. They were living immoral, unjust lives. And they were prospering nicely. Like we often hear the question, why do bad things happen to good people? You ever heard that before? But this psalm is dealing in part with the question, why do good things happen to bad people? And so this messed with him. And he seemed to be observing this for years, and the volcano was just about to blow, and he had had enough. Like, listen to him describe it in Psalm 73, verse 4. He says, these people who are thumbing their nose at God, they have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They're free from the burdens common to everyone. In verse 5, they're not plagued by human ills. And you understand, he's been in this place for so long, he's losing a little objectivity here. He's exaggerating a little bit here. They have no struggles. They have no problems at all. I'm plagued by all these things, but they're not, he's saying. Verse 6, therefore pride is their necklace. They clothe themselves with violence. He says they're unbelievably arrogant. They live without conscience. From their callous hearts comes iniquity. The evil conceits of their minds know no limits. He's saying they're imaginative and concocting new ways to inflict oppression and evil. And he goes on and on like this. Like in verse 8, they scoff God. They speak with malice. They threaten and oppress people. And verse 12, sort of the capper in this section of the psalm, he says these people, this is what the wicked are like. They're always carefree. They increase in wealth. Asaph says, God, I think I'm done. There are people that spit in your face. They mistreat people every day. And they're printing money. They're doing just fine. They don't seem to have a problem in the world. And I can't stand it. And so I'm out. And then he says something in the very next verse that's sort of the key to understanding the real root of it all, his sort of deeper issue with God. Get ready for this. Verse 13. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure. In vain have I kept my hands clean. All day long I've been plagued. I've been punished every morning. Can you feel what's going on in this guy's heart? Like at the core of the issue, he's saying, you know what? Maybe I'm the fool. Like I've kept my hands clean. I've kept my heart clean. And it all seems to be in vain. I bet the farm on living for God that it was going to provide some sort of provision and protection for me. And now I see that maybe the joke is on me. I might be the fool in all this. Gang, those of you who are serious followers of Jesus, serious Christians, maybe you've been on this path for a while and you take the claims of Jesus seriously and you take the commands of Jesus seriously. You've just busted it to try and honor God, to be the straight shooter, to be the model employee or the good neighbor or the honorable friend or the covenant keeper, whatever. And you believe that somewhere along the way is going to pay off. And then you have those moments, if you've done this for a while, you have those moments of disillusionment that comes crashing into your life. And you say, maybe I've been the fool all along. Maybe I'm taking all this way too seriously. I'm laying it down. I'm busting it out. And more than my fair share of problems, they just keep coming at me. And I'm doing things by the book. I'm denying myself all kinds of things. I'm denying myself all kinds of pleasure and fun. And it seems like in the words of Asaph here, in vain I've kept my heart pure, in vain I've kept my hands clean. Actually, one of the worst feelings in the world is that momentary realization that you might be the fool. You look around and you say, am I the only one who doesn't sort of cheat on their taxes? Am I the only one who tells the truth no matter what? Am I the only one who tithes 10% like God commands? Am I the only one who's keeping my sexual purity there intact? Am I the only one? Maybe I'm the fool. I remember one of the first times I kind of felt something like this, just a little something like this. Back when I was in school and I was struggling to keep up with a particular class that I was taking. I don't know, it was probably chemistry or physics or something like that. But some guys were going out to live it up a little, and they came by, and I said, I can't go. Like, I got to study. I got to figure this out. We got a test tomorrow. It's not looking good for me. And the guys, they said, Dave, we got the answers, man. Like, we got a source, and we've been getting the actual copies of the upcoming tests. And I'm listening to all this, and I'm thinking, am I the last one to this party? Like, am I the fool? Maybe I'm the fool. I don't think I'm the fool, but maybe I am the fool. I don't think I am, but maybe I am. And I remember the first time that kind of hit me a little bit. Later in my life, when I worked an hourly job, it was in retail. I was just trying to, scrape by to pay my insurance or, car loan, that kind of thing. And I worked with some folks that seemed to be in the same situation that I was. You know, they're college students or they just graduated college and all. And we got discounts, like as employees. We received 10% off merchandise in the store if we bought something there. And I remember seeing some of the folks that I worked with who seemed, you know, again, they're in the same situation I am, but they seem to have all the latest inventory, you know? Like they made the most of their 10% off thing, and they would be sporting a new pair of Nikes or Jordans, or I don't know, this is like the late 80s, early 90s, maybe it was the Reebok pumps. You remember those? Pump up your shoes. You know, they were just sporting all the latest stuff. And I thought, they must spend all their paycheck in the store. Until I happened to come across somebody in the back entrance of the store where we take out the trash, and they were sneaking inventory out that back door, parking near the dumpster and loading up on swag. And the guy told me, he said, Dave, everybody does it, man. The owners, they're doing just fine, you know. They don't even notice. And he was looking at me like, don't be a fool, Dave. And I'm like, I mean, maybe I am. Maybe this is how the world works. Maybe this is how everybody is. And maybe I'm the fool. I'll bet every one of you who takes things really seriously has had a moment or two where you were the one playing by the rules or shooting straight, being the good guy or the good gal. You're the one not cutting the corners or saving the truth. And then you look around at other people, many of whom claim to be Christians, and they're cutting corners, and they're shaving the truth, and they're hiding the deceit, and they're doing all this stuff, and it appears like they're getting away with it just fine. Their stock is rising. There don't seem to be any negative consequences that you can see. And you're tempted to say, maybe nobody lives this out. Maybe nobody is doing this. And I'm the fool because I'm still trying to. And you just turn that over in your head over and over again. And that's what Asaph was doing. He chewed on that for years. And finally he got to the point where he said, it's in vain that he's kept his heart pure. And it was in vain that he kept his hands clean. And he was really struggling with it. It just didn't seem to be working for him anymore. But in Psalm 73, there's this tipping point. Like something happens to Asaph. It says in verse 17 that he's having all these problems. And then here are the words. I came into the sanctuary of God. Like when I tried to understand all this, it was suffocating me. It was oppressive to me until I entered the sanctuary of God. In today's words, we would say he was having all this angst. And then he went to church one day. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But for Asaph, while he was in a worship gathering in the sanctuary of God, two truths come crashing into his brain. And I don't know if it's in the message. I don't know if it's in the music. I don't know what the service elements were that day in that particular worship service. But he was in the right place at the right time in the sanctuary of God. And he had two realizations explode in his mind. And the first one is this in verse 17. Then I understood their final destiny. These people that are pulling all this stuff off. And the second realization is in verse 18. Surely you place them on slippery ground. When Asaph pondered just these two truths, he left the sanctuary of God a transformed man. And if you don't believe me, just listen to what he writes in the last half of the psalm after he had resolved this sort of spiritual funk that he had been in, beginning in verse 23. Yet I am always with you. You hold me by my right hand. You guide me with your counsel. And afterward, he says, I get it now. You'll take me to glory. Verse 26, God is the strength of my heart and my portion. He's my hope forever, he says. And in the last verse, verse 28, he says, but as for me, it's good to be near to God. That's the choice I'm making, to be close to God. I have made the sovereign Lord my refuge. He's saying, I'm putting my eggs in his basket, and I'm going to tell everybody about his wonderful works. He says, you call me the fool if you want to, but as I look around, I'm going to stick with God. He's my portion. He's my hope. He's my refuge. He's my future. So like the beginning part of Psalm 73 is, I'm thinking about bailing on God. Like too many good things are happening to bad people. And I feel like a fool. I'm keeping my hands clean and all this. But then Asaph goes into the sanctuary, goes into worship. And he comes out on the other side, and he says it's worth it 100 times over, man, to follow God. It's worth it, so count me in. I'm still in. Now let's think a little bit about those two thoughts a little more deeply, because they could be equally transforming to all of us who have gathered here in this place of worship. Verse 17, I understood their destiny. Verse 18, you placed them on slippery ground. Now let's think about those things in reverse order, if we could. What does it mean for somebody to be on slippery ground? Asaph calls them far from God, these wicked people who are out living it up and all. And he says, wait a minute. Like I think I see, I have a new understanding. They're on slippery ground. And what does that mean, slippery ground? I think we understand about slippery ground. Like we just got hit with some slippery ground earlier this week, this past Thursday morning. Remember that? That old varmint, the groundhog, Puxatawny Phil, I guess he was right. Last Sunday, saw a shadow and said, hey, we're still in for some more winter, and it showed up on Thursday in the form of snow and ice. There's a reason that schools and businesses and all were closed on Thursday, because ice just draped the landscape, covered roads, covered sidewalks, covered trees, all that stuff. It's dangerous. You understand about slippery ground. It's not a good, solid place to be. Like one minute you're confidently doing something, and then the next you're flat on your back, and you're in a world of hurt. Asaph realized the concept of slippery ground in relationship to people who are not living for God. And if you look around, you know what we're talking about, and you can see it on display from time to time. Like this came to my mind leading up to today, this past week. A few years ago, some of you might remember Bernie Madoff. You remember Bernie Madoff? Finance guy who was one day having a world-class dinner in his world-class Manhattan apartment, and the next day he was eating prison food in a jail cell because he'd been standing all that time on slippery ground. He'd been ripping people off. Classic Ponzi scheme. And while he was doing that, he was living a big life. Lots of people envied his life. They wanted his glamorous lifestyle. But what they didn't know was that all along, he was on slippery ground. And one day his feet slipped, and no one envied him after that. And he was sentenced to 150 years in prison, which is where he died a few years ago in 2021. And it's not just like out there somewhere, you know, in the news that we see. You know people. Looks like they're living it up. They're living hard and fast, and they seem to be getting away with it. And they seem to be no consequences in their life for it. But then something comes out, and it all comes crashing down. And you realize it's just on slippery ground. Be careful, gang, of ever envying the lives of people who are far from God. Like be very careful of ever envying whether it's the rich and famous, you know, celebrities, rock stars, athletes, business titans, politicians, whatever. Or it's just a neighbor who appears to live it up. Because far more of them than you or I would ever know are standing on slippery places. And in the snap of our fingers, they could wind up exposed, indicted, convicted, humiliated. Asaph got gripped by that in a flash. God revealed that to him, and he was like, what am I doing envying all these people? Some high percentage of them are probably standing on slippery places. And it's just a matter of time. And let me add one more thing about this. Some of us in here are on slippery places. Got shady stuff going on in your life. And I strongly suggest, I am even willing to beg, that you move from a slippery place to solid ground today. And I pray that the Holy Spirit of God, through his word, and maybe even what we're doing here today, this morning, will just tear through your defense, cut through straight to your heart, and have you go, oh man, I'm standing in a very slippery place. And I got to end that. I got to get to better ground, more solid ground, or I'm going to end up humiliated and exposed and indicted or whatever. If God is nudging you about anything shady in your life right now, thank God that you came here today and that you were exposed to Psalm 73 and that maybe you can learn from somebody else's experience like Asaph. I'll say it one more time. if you're on a slippery place in your life, move to higher ground today, okay? The other truth that came crashing into Asaph's brain was that, and he simply says in verse 17, then I understood their final destiny. Like for the first time, he says, while I was in the sanctuary of God, I actually understood the eternal destiny of those who are living that way. And gang, this is a reality that we don't really want to talk about all that much in our world. We don't like it. And I don't think you're going to like that I'm going to talk about it for a minute here. But you have been given a soul. You didn't make it. You didn't ask for it. But here you are. And you have been given a will, this remarkable ability to be able to choose. And part of what that means is you cannot evade responsibility for your life. We live in such a therapeutic culture that we don't often use words like good and evil in normal conversation, but those words are the words that maybe matter most. And every day, little by little, you and I are turning into something. Our lives have a kind of moral, spiritual trajectory, and we are acquiring character. And that process, the formation of a character, of a soul, it might be the most important process that goes on in our world. Because you are an eternal being, and you will never cease to exist. And there is a reality of heaven, and there is a reality of hell. And again, we don't like to talk about this, but should we be afraid of hell? Absolutely. We should be more afraid of hell than anything else in the world. We should be afraid of becoming a lost soul. We should be afraid of choosing or drifting or growing or becoming the wrong kind of person. And this is a real possibility, and it will be real for countless people who are simply choosing not to think about it right now because we live in a world that just doesn't like to think about it. And listen, I love to be positive. I believe that the gospel is good news. It's not fearful news. I believe that to concentrate on what is good is the best way to live. I love joy. I love laughter. But I got this concern that this idea is becoming more and more prevalent, that the idea of hell is not really real, or that hell it's not so bad. It's not a big deal. Eternity is not really something I got to worry about or think about all that much. That idea does a lot of damage in our day. I believe we live in an age where there's kind of a massive unspoken, non-voted on collusion to dismiss the idea of hell without giving it serious, sustained adult attention. Even though the vast majority of people believe that there's going to be some sort of life after death, but we get real vague and we get fuzzy and we don't like to think about it all that much. And I don't think that's very wise. So I want us to understand that heaven is real and hell is real. Do you know the person in the Bible who talked more about hell than any other person? Jesus. Not because he wanted to scare people or have those people live in fear, but because the stakes are so high, man. And whenever Jesus talked about hell, he did so with a kind of sobriety and use of imagery that just stopped people dead in their tracks. Imagery of aloneness and darkness and regret and separation from God. You can even think of hell simply as separation from God. Somebody doesn't want anything to do with God, God will allow them to be separated from him forever. And you can think of heaven as life with God, unencumbered, uninhibited. Life with God, you see. But Jesus, he kept underlining the point that this is very real, that nobody escapes it, that everybody will face judgment, that you have an eternal destiny. And a lot of folks in our day, they don't like the idea of hell. There are whole movements of churches and Christians that just want to throw out the concept of hell, even though the Bible, particularly the New Testament, and especially Jesus, talked explicitly about it. But folks want to fashion thinking and theology about all this, not based on the Bible and not based on the words of Jesus, but in an effort to comfort and in the name of non-judgmentalism that's also on shaky ground. Asaph says, I couldn't figure it out. until I entered the sanctuary of God, until I got in a place of worship. And then I started to see the whole picture. He gets perspective, you see, that the goodness of God is not defined by the success of the wicked or the struggles of the faithful. The ultimate misery is to be eternally far from God, and the everlasting peace is to be eternally near to God. Asaph, self-convicted because he was envying all these prosperous people out there. And he finally comes to this realization where he says, why would I envy anybody who doesn't want to be near the Lord? And he says in verse 24, God, I'm going to be with you forever one day. I know I belong to you. And he realizes in church that day that so many of these other folks are on slippery places and they're not going to experience that. And so he says, why would I envy them? One time Jesus asked that cutting question, what does it profit someone to gain the whole world but lose their soul? And it's like Jesus cut through all the fog. And he says, everybody, just do the math, man. Take all the emotion out of it and do the math. You gain this whole world for the brief flash of time that you exist in it in the overall scheme of things. And then you lose your soul and you wind up separated from God forever. Think that one through, man. The math is horrible. Because the reality to come to grips with is you and I are going to be in eternity much longer than we're going to be here in this life. We will spend much longer in the next life than this life. So don't let any earthly temptation or distraction or entanglement or addiction compromise your relationship with God and the one who secures your eternal destiny. Make sure and get that part of life right. You know, as we wrap up, I want to take you back to that mind shift that occurred with Asaph. It came about in the sanctuary of God. We made sure to make it to worship, a normal church service. And I get really concerned for folks sometimes because of the culture in which we live. Like, how are we going to keep our heads on straight in a crazy world? How are we going to keep from envying the lives of people who are far from God? How are we going to keep the I'm a fool thing out of our minds? How are we going to deal with that? Well, I think Asaph would say, for starters, go to the sanctuary of God. Make it a discipline. Get in the place of worship of God every 7 days or more. Sit and listen because stuff will be revealed to your mind in that place that won't be revealed to you anywhere else. Get into a small group with people who talk about who the wise people in the world are and who the foolish people in the world are. Have a time each day when you meet with God and you read a psalm like Psalm 73. Like at the end of the psalm, verse 28, Asaph says, as for me, it's good to be near God. And so I've made my choice, man. I've decided. He says, high ground, one eye on eternity, my right hand in God's hand. He's leading my life. I'm going his way. You are not crazy for going his way, for following after Jesus Christ, full on every day, laying it down, living it out. You are not crazy. It's worth it. Like Jesus knew one time that his disciples kind of felt like fools. And so he says to them in the 10th chapter of Mark, no one who's ever left home or brothers or sister or mother or father or children or fields for me and the gospel will fail to receive 100 times over as much in this present age and in the age to come, eternal life. Jesus says it right there. And I just want to reiterate it. You're no fool for following fully after Jesus Christ. You are not crazy and you won't regret it. So be thankful for the life that God is allowing you to live. And let's be thankful for Jesus Christ who makes the whole thing possible. We're going to do that right now. We're going to think about Jesus and how he bridged this gap to connect us to God now and forever. It's through communion. We celebrate it every week. We take these individually wrapped packets of communion. They're in the back if you didn't get one. Has a little bit of bread, a little bit of juice. It reminds us of Jesus' body and his blood that was given up for us on the cross so he could connect us back to the God who loves us so very much. So let's take a few moments right now and let's thank God for Jesus through communion.